Hello everyone, and welcome back to Genesis Talks, ABC Media's special show. Today our guest is His Excellency Andrew Turner, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Canada to Armenia. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Ambassador.
Luzանկարներ for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
So let's start our conversation with the trade between Armenia and Canada. So Canadian and Armenian statistics report different numbers. However, I've tried to find some average for the total bilateral trade between Canada and Armenia, which is about 28 million American dollars. In my view, this number is not impressive, and I'm sure in Toronto or Vancouver, you have condos for sale for $28 million. However, beyond these numbers, are Canada and Armenia taking any special measures to improve bilateral trade?
Absolutely, and I think that it makes a lot of sense to start by focusing on the trade relationship, because at the end of the day, it's that sustained economic partnership and the interest from the business community that will generate the ongoing interest from the political level, create more opportunities for people to go back and forth, have greater awareness. So I think very much the focus on business and increasing that number has been a key focus for the embassy since I arrived. Obviously, the most important thing we have done to increase trade was to establish the embassy here in October of 2023, because we now have, for the very first time in our history, dedicated full-time officials working here in Armenia, doing nothing but working to promote the economic partnership between Canada and Armenia. And as a result, we have seen growth. So that number, as you say, yes, it is still low, but it has grown significantly even in the 3 years since the embassy has been in place. And the role of the embassy in being able to identify potential contacts, being able to share information with the Armenian community here about opportunities in Canada as well. And for the Canadian business community, the fact that Canada has shown confidence in Armenia as a market by opening the embassy and having trade teams here is in itself a vote of confidence that encourages them. They can reach out, ask questions they have about the market. And so we are seeing a lot of things that are happening. The other major step that I would point to is that we have worked closely with the private sector to help establish new business associations. So the Canada-Eurasia Chamber of Trade and Economy, based here in Armenia, and then in Canada we have the Canada-Eurasia Business Alliance, which are providing that direct business-to-business link, which I think is very, very important. Obviously, as part of the embassy, I want to emphasize the role of the embassy and governments, but at the end of the day, business people speak their own language, and having that business association and being able to provide direct matchmaking provides a lot of opportunities that to basically to understand or ask questions that people may not get the right answers or get the exact information they're looking for from government officials like myself. So by having both the embassy and the business association, we've been able to support several business delegations. We've been able to address a lot of questions that have come in. We've been able to flag potential opportunities that companies in both countries have taken advantage of. And we've also started to see the official level cooperation expand as well. So we now have an annual bilateral consultation process, and we always make sure to discuss trade and economic partnerships. Just in the last year, Armenia sent several delegations of officials and business people to look at the Canadian mining sector. So including going to the major international Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada conference, which is held each year, which is one of the big marquee international fora in the mining sector. And this was the first time in many years, so since I think before COVID, that Armenia had attended again. So I agree, the level we're starting from is low, but it has already grown a lot, and I think that these measures are laying the foundations for expanding it, going even further in the future.
Very good. So, and what are current Canadian direct investments into the Armenian economy, and what measures could encourage Canadian companies to invest more in Armenia? What do you think?
Well, the major areas we're seeing investment so far are, I would say, one, the mining sector, as I already mentioned. We're also seeing greater interest in the education sector and establishing partnerships.
What's the total amount? Do you have any data? What's the total amount of Canadian direct investments into Armenian economy?
No, it still would be in the low tens of millions, as you subscribe, as you mentioned, for the bilateral trade. So it's not yet a massive amount, but the potential is there, and particularly with some of the mining developments we have seen. We're still in the Canadian companies are still involved in the exploration phase, but if it continues and if it discovers exploitable deposits, then the potential then can expand very quickly, and we're seeing already interest from large Canadian mining companies like Teck in looking at the market. So it's, again, as with trade, the investment is limited, but the potential is there to expand. In terms of the measures, as I said, I think from the Canadian side, we've established the embassy and are just being able to engage more to get more information. So again, we go and meet with people here in different sectors, be it in agriculture, be it in mining, be it in, obviously, the ICT sector. And so we're identifying the opportunity so we can simply give more information. While we have the Armenian-Canadian community, many Canadian business people do not know much about Armenia. They do not know much about the market. So having the embassy here to provide that information is an important step. The other issue is that for many Canadian business people, what they would have known about Armenia was some of the challenges that the country has had in the past. So be it the difficulties of doing business because of problems with corruption or bureaucracy and red tape, and of course the uncertain regional geopolitical situation. So in terms of the other measures and the measures that the Armenian side is able to take, the fact that Armenia has made such progress in implementing reforms, in improving the business climate, as well as advancing the peace process to make the region appear more attractive to foreign investment, is quite significant. And I think what would be key is continuing the work that has already been done. The progress in reforms has been quite impressive, but Armenia still has a long way to go. It's moved very high up in several of the tables, but that still has left it kind of in the lower middle tier in many cases.
Got it. I'm curious, what's the evaluation of those Canadian companies? Because it seems you have done a tremendous job within the 3-4 years. What's the evaluation of Canadian companies of the Armenian market size and growth? This is number one. Mm-hmm. Number two, labor and infrastructure. And number three, regulations. How these three factors are evaluated by Canadian companies?
So obviously the biggest consideration or the biggest challenge when you're looking at Canadian business people's assessments of Armenia is that it is very far away from Canada. Right. So you can, obviously we have the transatlantic element on top of the geography of Europe is much closer. The Middle East is much closer. And of course, the traditional issue and what has been the bane of myself and all of my colleagues, particularly those who are focused on trade promotion full-time, is that traditionally Canadian business has looked almost exclusively to the US market because it is so close, so large, and so so easy to access. So now that we are able to provide greater information about the market, even though it is further away, that helps the Canadian businesses make their assessments. And of course, some of the uncertainty we have seen in the Canada-US trading relationship, although it remains very, very positive, there has been discussions about how to manage the relationship going forward. And that's, I think, created greater interest in the Canadian business community and in diversifying their partnerships and looking at other markets. So a country like Armenia that previously they would have discarded because it's so far away, it's an uncertain geopolitical situation and it's a difficult environment to do business, they are now much more open to. And I think the size of the market is another limitation. 3 million people. But when you're looking at some of the key sectors, and again, ICT and so on, again, modern technology, much work can be done virtually in different ways, or where the products are not being physically shipped. So that can help quite a lot. And then in those areas like agriculture, agri-food, where there is still the question of the logistics, then the situation has been improving. Again, it's much more easy, and we're seeing now, of course, the discussions in terms of Armenia and the access to the EU market. So it's much easier to look at.
For EU market, you need Ireland. You don't have to come to Armenia.
Indeed.
So, right?
But again, as I say, it is becoming both a destination that is more practical, and it will become even more so if the peace process continues and the borders are open fully. It's becoming a place where it is actually possible to do business, and this is I've had direct comparisons in several conversations with business communities, specifically or in particularly from the Armenian Canadian business community, contrasting their experience of saying, I want to help Armenia, I'd like to do something, I've done well in Canada, I'd like to come and invest and do business in Armenia. And 20 years ago they tried and they just couldn't get any traction. Bureaucracy, problems with corruption got in the way. And now they do find, yes, okay, it is possible. So as I say, we're still in a low level of the actual tangible number of businesses that are here, although as I say, it has already started to grow. But I think it is now in a situation where, because of the efforts the government has made, because of the investment that the Canadian government has made in the investment in creating the embassy and creating some of the resources to help Canadian businesses here, the assessment is much more positive about the market, and as I say, we have seen that reflected in the growth of trade and investment, which I think has only become more important as we go forward.
Now, let's talk a little bit about education and academic cooperation. So in your previous answer, you mentioned educational programs. How can young professionals in Armenia, the Armenian young workforce, benefit from closer ties with Canada? And are there any plans to expand educational partnerships, research, student exchange programs between Armenian and Canadian institutions such as University of Toronto, British Columbia University, McGill, and other best Canadian schools?
Very much so. Again, as I've mentioned, education is one of the sectors where we see a lot of interest from both sides, from both Armenia and Canada, in developing further the relationship. That's not to say there were not pre-existing relationships, but I would say in many cases it was more kind of one-off and based on specific individuals, knowing specific individuals. But what we're now seeing is a greater focus on really institutionalizing these partnerships. And so again, we've had, in the past few years since the embassy was open, we've been able to support several business delegations from Canada coming to Armenia to explore possibilities. And while they've been diverse and mixed groups, education has always been a key component of them.
Great.
So we're seeing, yes, as you mentioned, some of the universities you mentioned, UBC, others, Laval, they're working actively to establish direct partnerships. So obviously there is the long-standing number of Armenian students who go to Canada to study these different programs. And again, I'm regularly bumping into people who say, "Oh, Ambassador, yes, my son or my cousin is at, yes, U of T or in Manitoba or wherever." And that obviously is very positive, and we want to continue that. But as I say, having these institutional partnerships established in terms of, yes, helping to develop shared curricula, I think that's important to take it to the next level. Canada faces a specific challenge in terms of the student exchange, as you mentioned, in that we do not have a national program. Education in Canada is a provincial responsibility, so we don't have an equivalent of, I don't know, say the Chevening fellowships or the Fulbright's scholar program in the U.S., just because it's not a national jurisdiction. But we do have the individual provinces and the individual universities do have extensive programs that they are developing. And so by establishing these connections between institutions and Canada institutions here in Armenia.
And we have in Yerevan American University of Armenia and French University. Probably the Canadian institutions would be interested to cooperate with these schools.
Indeed, and we have Canadians who are actively involved in both of those institutions already. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think those are good examples of areas where there's some potential. In some ways, it can be a bit easier for partnership because you already have the common language. But we also have had discussions with Yerevan State University and others. So I wouldn't limit it to just those two. But those could be maybe the entry points because you have less of a language barrier in that sense.
All right. So Canada recognized the Armenian genocide long time ago. If I remember correctly, that process started in 2002. And then in 2006, Prime Minister Harper also recognized the Armenian genocide on behalf of the executive branch. Mm-hmm. And since then, all successive Canadian governments have continued to commemorate the Armenian genocide annually. So Canada marks April 24th as a day of remembrance of the Armenian genocide and its victims. Of course, genocide recognition is often seen as a form of a moral acknowledgement towards the victims and their descendants. But at the same time, I think states recognize genocide to reinforce those norms that are important, first of all, to name it, then to condemn it, and then not allow to fade that into the denial. Mm-hmm. So, and this somewhat also can be a part of the framework of genocide prevention promoted by the United Nations. However, in my view, international community doesn't have an ability to prevent genocides. And the example of Rwanda in 1994 and other examples are justify my point of view. However, maybe you have a different point of view, and I would like to ask you how effective is the international community in preventing genocides, and what are the main limitations of the current mechanisms? What do you think?
No, indeed. I think I have a very strong interest in the issue of the Armenian genocide because almost my introduction to Armenia back when I was still in high school, one of my major interests was always in studying history. In fact, that's what I did. My university undergraduate studies were in history. And so very early on, I encountered the history of not just the Armenian genocide, but also the history of the attempts to deny and even suppress historical inquiry into it. So as a historian or a student of history, I always found that very almost, it certainly wronged my professional sensibilities as a historian. So I think it is very appropriate that Canada and an increasing number of countries have recognized the Armenian genocide simply because it is an acknowledgement of historical fact. And as we have found in the Canadian context, specifically with regards to our discussions of our treatment of our Indigenous populations over the centuries, which unfortunately in some cases amounted to genocide. The Indigenous population of Newfoundland, the province of Canada where I grew up, were completely eradicated through the combination of hostility and disease and other factors. And it has taken Canada a very long time to come to terms with this very shameful part of our history, and we have not yet fully done so. And the process of reconciliation continues. But an important element of that was the recognition of this, this very dark chapter of our history. And so the recognition of these negative elements of our past is what enables us to then acknowledge that, okay, yes, this happened, and we need to face it, and we need to find ways of addressing it moving forward. So that recognition is the first step that can allow for development that hopefully puts us all in a situation where these types of where these terrible crimes and where genocides cannot happen again. I agree, the system is not perfect. This is the reality of the world we live in. The United Nations can be, both the institution and collectively the member countries of the United Nations can easily be attacked for the numerous times in which they have failed, and Rwanda is an obvious example. The reality is that, I don't think it is ever going to be perfect, and I don't think we can ever get to the stage where we have a 100% success rate. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And I think the situation is, if we look at the conditions we're dealing with now, I think it is, I think you can also point to progress. And again, if nothing else, I think there's now much greater awareness of some of these issues. If you go back into the periods of history, and unfortunately, of course, even with the Armenian genocide, many people at the time didn't know what was happening, had no interest, were able to
study the Armenian genocide in schools in Canada.
So again, there are many histories that look at it. Again, as I say, different school.
Because in the United States, I recently saw the bill was introduced to Congress to allocate certain budget to include the Armenian genocide in public schools program, which was it is a very effective step.
Yeah. So I must admit I don't know, in part because, as I say, Canada's education system is, we don't have a Canadian education system. We have 10 or different education systems for the different provinces and territories and other elements. But as you mentioned, Canada has officially recognized the genocide and designated an official day on the 24th for commemoration, and the Prime Minister issues a statement. So there are certainly mechanisms to do so. And of course, we have a very active Armenian Canadian community, which regularly organize events to not just the commemoration of the genocide, but also education about the history of the genocide, as well as, of course, of many other aspects of Armenian history and culture. So as I say, I'm not sure about specific programs within the educational systems, but certainly I would say that, yes, there is plenty of information and there is increasing knowledge of the Armenian genocide and its history across Canada.
All right, now let me diverge from politics and bring up one question. I'm sure Armenian ice hockey fans would appreciate your answer. So the Montreal Canadiens was the last Canadian team to win the Stanley Cup Finals in 1993. That was a great team. But since then, all teams in National Hockey League representing Canada have reached the Stanley Cup Finals, and recently the Edmonton Oilers, I think in 2025, they got into the finals. But American franchises have held the championship ever since. So what happened, Ambassador? Why can't Canadian teams win the Stanley Cup within 33 years? That's although Canadian national team won World Cup and Olympic Games within this period several times. But what's the problem in National Hockey League?
So I think there are several factors at play. One is simply, as you mentioned, yes, simply the numbers involved. There are many more American teams than there are Canadian teams. So that just creates a certain mathematical probability that favors the Americans in that sense. But the second thing, as you note, is that yes, Canadian national teams still do incredibly well and are one of the most dominant, if not the most dominant team in hockey around the world. And this is also reflected, of course, in that significant numbers of the players on these American teams that have won championships and have won the Stanley Cup have been Canadian. So that is also a sign simply of the increasingly multinational dimension of sports, and particularly of professional leagues like the National Hockey League, that there are many players from Canada who are playing for US teams, there are many players from Europe. I'm not sure if we have any Armenian players yet, but hopefully...
No, I think almost every team in National Hockey League, you have Russian players, right?
Certainly a large number of Russians, large number of Scandinavians, but very, very significant numbers of Canadians. So I think this is as well, of course, as a growing and significant number of Americans. And I think this is a good sign of the growth of the sport and an example of how international relations, or perhaps more directly people-to-people ties, can be encouraged through sport. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's a very positive sign that Armenia will be hosting the Jeux de la Francophonie next year, because again, you'll be bringing, and of course, not just the athletes in the context of the Francophonie Games, but also there are cultural competitions and other elements. So I think just as we have seen right now actively ongoing with the World Cup and the joint hosting between Canada, the US, and Mexico has highlighted examples of potential for cooperation, even in times when we've had the ongoing discussions about the renegotiation of our North American Free Trade Agreement. The potential for sport to help bring countries and people together remains a very positive one. So all of that said, I would still like to see a Canadian team win.
Sure. So now let's get to the last section of our discussion. I would like to talk with you about Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech in Davos in the World Economic Forum, because this speech drew a lot of attention and sparked widespread discussion. Some of my friends from Canada after that speech told me that, after this speech, President Trump can become even more aggressive, although I disagree with them, because the speech, again, it sparked a lot of discussion. And Prime Minister Carney argued in that speech that the old world order is not coming back. This is what he said. And he suggested that middle powers have greater agency than it's usually assumed. So, and he also suggested on behalf of Canada that, middle powers can work together than simply rely on great powers. Was he suggesting some kind of a new international architecture? And if yes, which countries does Canada prefer to see that? Which countries are the most important partners of Canada in this new international architecture?
I think the key element of Prime Minister Carney's speech in Davos, and it is likewise a message that he has reiterated in other fora since then, including, of course, most relevantly here in Yerevan when he attended the European Political Community Summit, in which Canada was the first non-European country to participate, is not necessarily explicitly remaking a brand new institutional architecture, but to highlight the need to, yes, as he said, to take the sign out of the window, to kind of open our eyes and acknowledge that, yes, there has been this rupture, and we can't just kind of close our eyes or stick our head in the sand and pretend that it hasn't happened, and that we need to address it. And there are, again, we do have institutions in place like the United Nations, but it's clear that at times they are not able to function, and particularly in instances of disputes between the great powers where there is disagreement. I think that to go back to your first comment about whether or not that speech has had created any issues for Canada-U.S. relations, I think it's important to emphasize that even in periods where the Canada-U.S. relationship has had more difficulties, and over the years, over the decades, it has gone up and down. We've had disagreements in the past, the Iraq War, Vietnam, all kinds of issues, ongoing, periodic.
In the Middle East.
Yes, as I say, the Iraq War, for example, and ongoing periodic or recurring debates over aspects of our trade relations. Softwood lumber is an obvious example that comes up every few years. So the periods of disagreement and heightened tensions are normal, as they are normal in any relationship. But the key thing to remember is that even in those moments, the overwhelming majority of Canada-U.S. relations continue to function incredibly well. We have a strong economic partnership. We have a strong military partnership. There are millions of Canadians and Americans who go back and forth. So the occasional blips in the relationship or dips are often then balanced out by improvements in other areas. So I too would not worry too much about impact from the speech on Canada-U.S. relations. And in terms of the idea that yes, countries can have much more agency and act to form partnerships is again, this is something that Canada has long championed. And I think it's a scenario that we see to some degree with both Canada and Armenia, where we have had traditionally very, very strong economic ties in particular with one large regional country, the US for Canada or Russia for Armenia, and that there are times when that can create many, many obvious advantages and benefits, but that there are also some times when there are disadvantages. And therefore this message of diversification is an important one, and I think it is one that both Canada and Armenia have been pursuing. And I think that the hosting of the European Political Community Summit was an excellent demonstration of this principle in action. Europe is already recognized by the creation of the European political community that they cannot just limit themselves to the EU, but they need to look at the broader European family. And then having Canada participate, I think, demonstrates even more the need to engage with a wide range of partners. So for me, I think it was very, very positive to see Canada join for the meeting here, but I thought it was particularly appropriate that it happened in the EPC summit that was being hosted in Armenia, because Armenia itself has been doing such work in recent years to diversify its own relationships, expand its partnership with Europe, expand its partnership with India, expand its partnership with China, while still maintaining strong relations with Russia, just as Canada is working to diversify our relations while still maintaining very strong relations with the United States. So I think the speech is again, it's an important moment, and going back to my comments about the genocide, or genocide recognition, when you're dealing with problems, the start of the problem is to acknowledge that yes, this is the reality we are facing, and there's no sense in trying to hide or deny it. So I think that was one of the key elements of the speech, and now the strategy that Canada is putting in place is to build these new partnerships. And again, in some cases, it will mean working within existing partners and institutions. Just in the last few days, we made a decision to make a major military purchase of submarines from a company in Germany because of the links and the interoperability that creates with our NATO allies. In other cases, it will mean we expand and look at new partners that we have not done as much work with. And then that's where I see, to go back to the beginning of our discussion, the potential for the increased economic partnerships between Canada and Armenia.
Okay, in that speech, Prime Minister Carney also argued that Canada should build coalitions that work rather than rely on traditional multinational institutions. Does this represent the end of Canada's long-standing, strong identity as a champion of universal multilateralism?
No, I don't think so. And again, you can see that that has been maintained in our ongoing engagement with the United Nations, with the Commonwealth, with the Francophonie, with the various specialized agencies under them, with regional
and
organizations, NATO, the OSCE. There are many, many examples. So I think, no, it's not that it's not an either-or choice. So again, continuing to work, and as I mentioned, just the examples of the contract with Germany for the submarines taking place within the NATO context. When existing institutions work and are able to address the problems, then it makes sense to continue to work through them because they already have, yes, the systems in place, the institutions are there, it becomes much easier. But if there are scenarios where those institutions are not able to address the issue, or an institution for the particular challenge needs to be looked at, then it's an example of, okay, well, we need to develop new coalitions, new partnerships. And again, in some cases, they can be focused on, okay, where can we cooperate on economics? In other cases, it may be security. In other cases, it may be humanitarian issues. But I think, no, Canada remains a firm champion of multilateralism. It's simply a question of, in some cases, the multilateralism may need to be of a particular kind as opposed to just going through the traditional UN or NATO or other organizations. So again, you form the coalition that you need to work with to address the challenge that you're facing.
Okay, and my last question. In his speech, Prime Minister Carney also mentioned that countries should be at the table, not on the menu. So what advice would you give to small states that want to remain relevant in this already changing international environment?
I think the key thing is...
I'm sorry, because it's everything clear when it comes to the great powers and middle powers. But what would be your advice for smaller states? Because there are too many in this world, right?
Yeah, so that is, that's just an unavoidable reality of the world that we live in. There are some countries that are large, there are some countries that have very significant military capabilities, there are some countries that are smaller and that don't have the same. There are some countries that have strong economic power, and it's just a question of identifying, okay, where you fall within the situation and what circumstances you're dealing with, what challenges you have to face, and what tools you have to face them. Canada is very fortunate to be a very successful country, but if you put us, even though geographically we are bigger than the United States, we are 10 times smaller in terms of our population. And so there are ways you have to try to look at that. That creates specific dynamics in the relationship. Now, we have developed and managed them very effectively in a way that has created one of the longest lasting and strongest partnerships in the world. If you look at countries in Europe, you had extensive, centuries-long history of conflict between the different countries on the continent, but then the development of new mechanisms that evolved into the European Union have created a new framework for addressing them. So for small countries, a country like Armenia, then certainly there, I think, is a strong advantage to supporting multilateralism and the rules-based international order. I think there's also a strong argument for making every effort to develop strong and diverse partnerships so that we're not in a situation where we put all our eggs in one basket because of the potential vulnerabilities that can create. As Prime Minister Carney said, dependence can be exploited. So I think that for small countries, the the importance of having diverse partnerships cannot be overstated, and particularly because we are going to be increasingly facing challenges that will impact countries. And again, the first example I can think of would be climate change, where if you look particularly at some of the small island states, they will fare particularly worse in terms of the impact of rising ocean levels and the broader disruption of weather and the other negative impacts from climate change. So there are efforts to work together collectively. And of course, I think climate change is an extreme example where it's going to take collective effort by the entire world to address. But I think if you look on other examples more regionally, then I think Armenia's strategy in recent years of diversifying its partnerships, establishing diplomatic relations with more countries, improving relations with the neighbors, at trying to advance the peace process, while simultaneously still maintaining a strong partnership with Russia, is a very sensible one. And again, as a country which, again, on a a worldwide scale, right, you could put, Canada is not it may not be as small as Armenia, but we're not, we're not the biggest country in the world, and particularly we're much smaller than our neighbor. That importance of both diversifying while maintaining the strong partnership that Canada and the U.S. has benefited tremendously from our relationship with the U.S. So it's a question of striking the balance between them. And I think obviously for Armenia it's much more difficult because of the history, because of the ongoing unresolved conflict, although again, now at least the peace agreement has been initialed, and there is a framework that can lead to the resolution. But I think that even in that context, Armenia has, I think, pursued a very sound strategy of, expanding its partnership with Europe, increasing cooperation with India, with China, again, establishing embassies in different parts of the world, in Africa and Latin America.
Right. All countries, they have diversified foreign policy. They all want to have good relations with their neighbors and everybody. But I love your optimism, because we live in a dangerous world. So this ongoing war in Ukraine, where I don't see the end of that war, unfortunately, and the war in Iran, which is it seems it's settled. However, there is always a possibility of the resumption of military activity, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, situation in Yemen. Everywhere where I go, I really see how dangerous our world is. So, but at the same time, I really liked your optimism.
Well, I try to be, again, and I think it is particularly easy to be optimistic right now in Armenia. My diplomatic career took me to places like Syria during the Arab Spring. I served in Afghanistan, I served in Iraq, and so several countries where there were ongoing conflicts, where the efforts from the international community to address the crises have been met with limited success, and in some cases have been reversed. So by comparison, looking at a situation like I found here when I arrived in Armenia, again, many challenges. The embassy was opened in October of 2023, so just weeks after the military operation in Nagorno-Karabakh. To have seen where we were then, and again, even before I came here, I'd spent 4 years working on Canada's relations with the region from the Foreign Ministry in Ottawa. So I was involved in the 2020 war and everything that has followed. So to come from that situation to then the situation now, as I'm coming close to the end of my mission, where we have the impact of the Washington agreements, we have the initial peace agreement, we have the participation of Armenia in fora like the European political community. There has been no violence for several years. And so while there are still many unresolved issues, if you look at where Armenia is now compared to where it was when I arrived, or even when I started working on the file back in 2019, it's hard not to be optimistic about seeing what has been accomplished. So yes, there's still many ways things could go wrong. The world is an uncertain place, but I am very, again, I maintain my optimism, and maybe it is a professional bias of diplomats, but I think there is a lot to be optimistic about, and I don't think I'm just being naive. I think I can present a credible argument and evidence to support my optimism.
Sure, I know. I have been in your shoes for many years. Yeah. I also worked in the Foreign Ministry of Armenia for more than 10 years. Again, thank you very much, Ambassador Turner, for being with us. I think it was a very productive conversation. So our guest today was Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Canada to Armenia, His Excellency Andrew Turner. And on behalf of everyone here at ABC Media Special Show, thank you for joining us.